Hello. In Chapter 35, we are going to look at the growth of nations and economies in Asia, including East Asia, the Pacific Rim, and Southeast Asia. So in Part 1, we're going to start by looking at Japan and some other areas of the Pacific Rim, and then in Part 2, we'll move on to China and Vietnam. So, by way of introduction, after World War II, East Asia will see Japan emerging as the industrial great power. You'll remember that before the war, Japan had already industrialized. It was a significant industrial power. Another aspect, another theme that you'll see throughout the period is that Asian nations will seek to preserve a uniquely Asian culture, despite the fact that they're coming out of long periods of domination by imperial powers. China and Vietnam are going to see full-scale revolutions to implement communism, and they will see the end of Confucianism, which had been the predominant ideology for thousands of years. And you see a picture here of the Bird's Nest. This was the famous stadium at the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And the Beijing Olympics was a big event for China because it really signaled China's introduction into sort of the first world, or the developed world at this point. And the Olympics, as we talked about a little bit in Chapter 33, kind of signals a nation stepping into global prominence. So that was a big deal for Beijing, but of course they dealt with a lot of problems with pollution leading up to the Olympics. On to Japan. So after the war, the Americans will occupy Japan. Japan's military will be disbanded, and that military remains disbanded today. There is no real military force in Japan today. They have only a small self-defense force. That is actually a provision in Japan's Constitution. The Article 9 of Japan's Constitution does away with their military. Also in Japan, you'll see the end of Shintoism, and women's suffrage will be granted after World War II. However, Japan does retain its unique culture. It focuses heavily on respect for elders, group consciousness. They value education highly. You'll also see intense government control and a strict meritocracy. And that basically means that there is a lot of focus on merit and achievement and becoming an excellent employee, student, and of course we've talked about this before, failure to live up to those standards often results in a sense of shame, and in some cases you see high rates of suicide in Japan because of that shame and the lingering effects of the Bushido Code. The Liberal Democratic Party becomes the main ruling political party in Japan. In fact, it remains a majority party and dominates Japan's government until the 90s. So it's very rare that you see one party dominating the government in a multi-party system. But one of the reasons why the Liberal Democratic Party is able to do that is because they do work with the other parties. They do offer concessions. They're able to reach compromises. So you'll see that party predominant for a longer period of time. But it is important to understand Japan did have a multi-party system. So this is not like in the Soviet Union where they had one party and it was communism. Japan did have a multi-party system. The Liberal Democratic Party held control for many years. The party's success was due in part to their willingness to work with opposition parties. But as growing corruption seeps in, you're going to start to see the downfall of the Liberal Democratic Party. Another aspect of Japanese government is that it will promote birth control and abortion. One of the major issues in Japan is to limit population growth. It's a very small archipelago, not a lot of land available for the growth of population. So the government really tries to increase incentives to use family planning methods. Education and traditional artistic styles are also going to be promoted across Japan. We'll see an economic surge after the war in Japan. As a result of the demilitarization of Japan, all that money that would have otherwise been fueling a military is devoted to industry. Essentially what this means is that the government, as it brings in tax dollars, it doesn't have to use those tax dollars to fund a military. So instead, the government is able to offer tax breaks and other tax incentives to businesses and entrepreneurs that are getting started. So it uses these techniques to encourage industry and to promote education. You cannot have an industrial society, you cannot have a strong economy in today's world without a good education system. Another thing that Japan has working in its favor is that they have a strong tradition of group loyalty. Japanese are also infused with a strong work ethic. Those things sort of go hand in hand. And there's not a lot of challenging, you don't really see big union movements in Japan. People are pretty accepting of management's decision. Part of that is because of that group loyalty and the group think. As they become part of a company, they become intensely loyal to that company, much like the samurai were loyal to the daimyo back in the days of feudalism, Japanese feudalism. And that cultural tradition still holds over. So you see here in the graph on the right, the purple line represents the growth of Japan's economy, vastly outpacing other major regions of the world throughout the from the end of the 19th century throughout the 20th and now into the 21st century. Culture and society is changing. Women are now expected to go to work. However, they have very slowly relinquished their domestic roles. What you are starting to see, and this is pretty common in most Western societies after World War II, is that as women begin to enter the workforce more and more, the men aren't quite ready to step up and take their fair share of domestic duties. So women are expected to both work outside the home and be primarily responsible for household responsibilities for the children. That is slow to change. You see that in Japan. You see that even here in the United States in some cases. Children in school are actually taught conformity. In this country, there's a lot of emphasis on individuality, on being unique, on expressing yourself. You will not find that in Japanese schools. You find conformity, and that again goes hand in hand with the group loyalty and the work ethic and the support of your superiors and the shame culture that is infused into children very young. However, as Japan becomes increasingly globalized, it can't help but see some cultural changes. One of these things is actually baseball. Japan is one of the few nations in the world to actually adopt and share the American appreciation for baseball. Another thing that we'll start to see in Japanese families is that the younger generations of Japanese will start to question the veneration or the sort of age-old respect that they had for their elders. There starts to be less focus on that, and Japan is having a problem today with a large elderly population, not a very big population of younger and middle-aged people to take care of their parents. So they are actually finding ways to staff retirement homes with robots, and even finding robotic forms of companionship for elderly people to prevent loneliness as old age kind of sets in. Another cultural change, eating with knives and forks is introduced. You start to see chopsticks being phased out a little bit. Not that they're not still used across Japan, but you do start to see a mixture of eating styles. Environmental issues will grow. Pollution becomes a problem, but it is a problem that Japan tackles head on, and this is where you're going to see some of the first introduction of hybrid vehicles and some other alternative energy formats. Moving on now to Korea. Now, when we left off on Korea, it was a divided peninsula, and it remains divided to this day. In the south, you have the Republic of Korea, and in the north, the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. Now, that is a very misleading name for an extremely repressive dictatorship. The People's Democratic Republic of Korea is a repressive communist state. And you notice from this picture down here, a satellite image of the Korean peninsula at night shows you pretty clearly the disparities between the two halves of Korea. In the north, very little development, very little electricity. A little bit here, this is Pyongyang, the capital. In the south, highly developed, highly prosperous economy, and this satellite image is a great indicator of the disparity across the peninsula. The North Korean invasion of South Korea led the U.S. and the UN to go in jointly to push back the North Koreans. We talked about this previously in Chapter 32. The main goal here was to contain communism. Remember, that was the U.S.'s policy following World War II, was the containment of communism. The Korean War was fought under Douglas MacArthur, an American general. Chinese forces came in to aid the North Koreans, and the war ended in a stalemate in 1953 with the two sides agreeing to divide the peninsula in the middle, and it remains divided at this point today. South Korea becomes an authoritarian state. So it's important to understand that neither one of these countries really become free, open, liberal democracies like we have here in the United States. Syngman Rhee, who is the first leader of South Korea, will actually be forced out of power, but he himself was an authoritarian leader. He will be replaced with new authoritarian leaders, and they will suppress most of the opposition. The primary emphasis for South Korea is going to be on economic growth. And essentially, the entire population kind of has to buy into this. It's all about production. It's all about growth, growth, growth. It is, like Japan, a very hard-working society, and there is nowhere more indicative of that than in the Hyundai Corporation. The Hyundai Corporation is so large that it pretty much governs Southeast Korea. It's basically taken over that pocket of Korea and established operations there. The corporation provides its workers with free housing, free schools, and free recreational facilities. Kind of sounds like a bit like what Stalin did, only it's actually done much more effectively. The corporation becomes very prosperous throughout the latter half of the 20th century. And if you're not familiar with Hyundai, they are a car company. The employees of Hyundai are very well taken care of, but in exchange, they're expected to work a 6-day week with only 3 vacation days a year. You can see here the Hyundai headquarters here, designed by architect Daniel Lebskind. So the results. there is an economic boom in Korea. All of the nation's energy is focusing on making Korea a high-tech commercial society. The population will soar, and the government will have to step in to encourage the limitation of birth rates. Once again, like Japan, encouraging more family planning mechanisms like birth control and abortions to limit the amount of children people are having. Of course, they're also going to have problems with pollution and smog. As you get more people living in cities, more people driving cars, they're going to have to find ways to implement alternative energy sources to tackle that. However, incomes are growing, and even the poor in South Korea are actually pretty well off. So it is, even to this day, still a fairly authoritarian state. There's not a lot of emphasis on free speech or personal liberty, but that has worked for them, economically speaking, and there is a very high standard of living and high quality of life. Taiwan. Now, after the communists under Mao Zedong took over mainland China, you'll hopefully remember that Chiang Kai-shek's party fled to Taiwan, fled to the island of Taiwan off the coast of China. Now, China today still considers Taiwan part of China. Taiwan considers Taiwan to be separate. The hostilities with China continue. In fact, China will bomb a couple of their islands, Quemoy and Matsu, and a couple of the outlying islands here. And eventually the U.S. will put some pressure on Communist China to take a day off every other day, and so the U.S. will supply these islands on the days off, and so Communist China will agree to fire on only one island per day rather than both. The U.S. continues giving economic aid to Taiwan until the 1960s. Now remember, the U.S. had supported Chiang Kai-shek. They were hoping that he would win the civil war in China and establish a democratic regime there. And they will continue to support him for about 20 years after the fall of China. But you don't really see a liberal democracy in Taiwan either. Like Japan and South Korea, Taiwan focuses on economic planning, and to promote that, they're going to establish a lot of educational initiatives. They're really going to focus on encouraging private business through tax incentives. But they will be an authoritarian state under Chiang Kai-shek and then under his son. Over time, Chiang Kai-shek's son will promote more open, more liberal policies, but even today, it is still not quite as open or liberal as the United States. The U.S. commitment to Taiwan, however, ends in 1978. At this point, Richard Nixon, the U.S. president, establishes, he had visited China previously and sort of opened up to discussion, opened mainland China and the United States up to a relationship, and officially in 1978 the U.S. government establishes diplomatic relationship with mainland China. But since mainland China is the enemy of Taiwan, since the two don't really get along, establishing a diplomatic relationship with mainland China means that the U.S. has to end its commitment to Taiwan. Therefore, Japan will become Taiwan's main trade partner. Now, why does the United States open relations with communist mainland China? Well, part of the answer to that question is that by 1978, communism has loosened up a bit. They've implemented some capitalist components into their economy. Mao Zedong has fallen from power. And the United States, honestly, they're in it for their own good, too. They recognize that China is a huge market. that doing business with China will ultimately help the U.S. economy. So it helps us more to be established with China than Taiwan. And we do trade with Taiwan today. But again, Japan is really Taiwan's main trade partner. Hong Kong, if you remember, Hong Kong started out as one of the two trade ports that the Europeans were allowed into. It actually remains a British colony until 1997. At that point, Hong Kong is returned to China, but there is an agreement in Hong Kong that China will have sort of a different set of standards for that city. They have a free market economy. The citizens living in Hong Kong are not under the strict censorship that the rest of China, or the government surveillance that you see in the rest of China. In fact, Google has had some run-ins with China and Chinese censorship. Google has pretty much removed itself from most of China, from mainland China, but it does maintain some operations in Hong Kong because there is not the same level of surveillance and censorship there. So Hong Kong kind of serves as a bridge between China and the rest of the world. Even prior to 1997, leaders and businessmen who wanted to trade with China oftentimes would go to Hong Kong and, sort of meet with Chinese tradesmen there. Hong Kong becomes a leader in international banking. You're going to see high-tech industries thriving. Textile and clothing industry also going to be growing. People of Hong Kong are used to working long hours and getting paid low wages, which means this is a great place to outsource to. And in 1997, an agreement with China promised respect for the free market system and political rights. Singapore, another very small British colony, very down here at the very end of Malaysia. That's where you'll find Singapore. It becomes independent from Great Britain in 1965. It will contain a British naval base there for another 6 years until 1971. Today, it is still an important trade port, and you can see, just geographically why that would be. Singapore, like Taiwan, like South Korea, maintains an authoritarian structure. It is justified because it is such a small area with such a dense population. Singapore is basically a country that is also just a city. They maintain tight controls due to the high population density. They control people's morality, their sexual behavior. They crack down very heavily on corruption. They regulate the economy very intensely. Now, they're not a communist society, but it is a capitalist country with a lot of economic regulation. So it's sort of more of a mixed economy. The government doesn't own everything, but they do have a lot of regulation and a lot of controls on the corporations that exist in Singapore. Singapore is the fourth largest port in the world. It is a capital of the banking industry, as well as textiles, electronics. They have a lot of oil refineries and shipbuilding plants as well. So some common themes that we see in the Pacific Rim. Focus on the economy, strong group loyalty. You don't just see this in Japan. You see this in Korea as well, in South Korea. This is why the Hyundai employees work 6 days a week and are content with only 3 vacation days a year. Strong work ethic, going hand in hand with that group loyalty. They're also going to influence some of their neighbors, which have been called in recent years the little tigers, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. These are developing economies that are not quite up to the advanced stage that we see in South Korea and Taiwan and Japan, but they are rapidly developing their industries. They're gaining from a lot of foreign investment, and you're starting to see them come sort of onto the world stage as some major economies. And in a few years, we're really going to see them bloom into some very large and very prosperous economies as well. However, the economic downturn of the 1990s will lead many to question whether Western models will be adopted. Most of the Pacific Rim suffered from a recession in the 90s, and many said at that point, are we really on the right track? But overall, they've come out of that. They've maintained their growth. They've maintained their important role in world trade. And I think in the future, we're going to continue to see these Pacific Rim nations be very important in global business and global trade and in foreign relations as a whole. That's going to wrap us up for part 1. So part 2, we'll discuss China and Vietnam.